Hello, my name is Cameron Sabat, and welcome to Cutting to the Case. Today we're joined by Dr. Nicholas Teets, Associate Professor of Entomology at the University of Kentucky, where his laboratory studies how insects survive environmental stress, particularly extreme cold. His research spans insect physiology, molecular biology, genomics, diapause, and adaptation to changing environments. He earned his BS from Miami University and PhD in entomology from the Ohio State University, and his research has taken him to Antarctica, where he studied the Antarctic midge, Belgica antarctica, to understand how organisms survive some of the most extreme conditions on Earth. His work also examines how temperature affects agricultural pests and invasive species, with broader implications for agriculture, ecology, and climate change. Dr. Teets, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So, I wanted to start out with one of the questions that's on everyone's mind, which is you study insects that survive some of the harshest environments on Earth. What got you fascinated by that?
That's a really good question. When I was a kid, I was always drawn to the animals that pushed life to the extremes. And so my first kind of love or my first organism I fell in love with were cheetahs because I was just really fascinated with how they could move so fast. And I had a book when I was a kid. It was like the Guinness Book of World Records for animals. I forget the exact title of it, but it showed, this is the biggest animal, this is the fastest swimmer, and all these different things that, we don't think are possible, but there's an animal out there that can do that. So I've always kind of been drawn to that idea of pushing the extremes. And so when I started as an undergraduate at Miami University, my first love was herpetology. I was always really fascinated by frogs and turtles. I had them as pets as a kid, and there was a lab there that studied how some frogs can survive freezing. And so you freeze them and they look like a frozen hockey puck of a frog, and then you thaw them out and they just slowly come back to life and start. It's almost like they call it spontaneous animation is what it looks like. You think this frog is dead to rights and it wakes up. And I thought that was really cool. But the professor there, they had projects on reptiles or reptiles, amphibians, but also on insects. And the professor, Dr. Richard Lee, convinced me to give the insects a try. He said there's a lot more career options in entomology and insect biology. And so to think about that. So I started working a little bit with the Antarctic insect that I focused on while I was an undergraduate. I wasn't doing any trips there, just doing it in the lab and kind of got hooked on it from there.
Wow, wow. And you ended up doing field work as well in Antarctica. What's it actually like trying to do science there?
I mean, it's an amazing place. It's a special place. I would hope that everybody would get a chance to go there at some point. It's just a magical, nowhere else like it on Earth. So we primarily our work is funded by the National Science Foundation, and they maintain three research stations on the continent. We go to the smallest of those called Palmer Station, which is in the Antarctic Peninsula, which is that tail that comes up, shoots out of Antarctica towards South America. And that's really the biodiversity hotspot of Antarctica. It's the warmest part of Antarctica. It's near there's lots of small ice-free islands that are temporarily, where the snow and ice temporarily melts in the summer. And so they can support plant life and it's the insects that we work on. And it's just really a special place. You get to your typical trip to Antarctica for our projects is you're on station for 5 or 6 weeks. The station is only accessible by a ship, by a research vessel, so it takes 3 or 4 days to get there on a vessel from Chile. And then once you're there, the ship drops you off and leaves. And so it's, there's no roads, no stores. It's a much different place than anywhere I've ever been before.
Hmm.
And you get to spend it with 40 other really cool people who just enjoy the science and the work, and you work hard while you're there. You're there for a short time, you try to make the most of it, but it's a fun community, and the landscapes and the wildlife are just breathtaking.
Oh, I can imagine. That must be beautiful. And one of the wildlife that you study is the Antarctic midge. What makes this tiny insect so remarkable?
Yeah, so this insect is one of the toughest on the planet. Where I work in a department of entomology, and so people in my department were really proud of the diversity of insects and the abundance of insects. And there's been over 1 million described species of insects. So 3 out of every 4 described animal species on the planet is an insect. They're incredibly diverse. found in every habitat throughout the globe, but Antarctica is kind of the exception to that rule. There's only two true insects that survive in Antarctica naturally, and so this Antarctic midge that we work on is one of them. And that's primarily because insects are cold-blooded, and so it's really hard for them to be able to get through a life cycle and reproduce in during these short, cold growing seasons of Antarctica. It's above freezing for typically maybe 3 to 4 months a year, depending on where you are in Antarctica along the peninsula. And so they don't have a lot of time, and so it's really hard to survive there as an insect. And so we're really kind of interested in how did this one species make it what and it's it's been in Antarctica as long as Antarctica has been a continent. So how has it been able to make this harsh place its home and survive and actually thrive? It's incredibly abundant in certain places, and so we're really just trying to figure out what it's doing there.
Yes, yes, and that poor insect. I can't imagine. Um,
Yeah.
when winter hits, then can you walk us through what actually happens inside an insect that allows it to survive extreme cold?
Yeah, that's some of what we're working out. And there's a variety of biochemical and physiological processes that insects, including this species, use to survive winter. Some of the ones that our lab has worked on, in particular, so they do produce molecules called cryoprotectants, which are typically small sugars or sugar alcohols or sometimes amino acids that accumulate in the bloodstream and help protect cells against freezing injury. And so it's almost similar to antifreeze in your car, although in this case they do actually freeze, but these molecules help protect some of the other cellular structures from the damage caused by the ice. Now, that being said, the Antarctic midge is not a major accumulator of these. There are insects in temperate places in North America that make a lot more of these molecules. So we don't think it's the kind of the main reason why they're so tolerant of freezing. But some of the other things they do that we've figured out, one thing that's really important in a lot of different biological processes, ranging from the insects we study, but even in disease phenotypes like cancer and aging, is that kind of tipping point, that seesaw tipping point between whether a cell survives or whether it goes through a programmed cell death pathway, examples being like apoptosis or there's necrotic cell death. One of the things that this Antarctic midge does, and what's, we can't say for sure at this point if it's specific to the Antarctic species because we haven't looked at enough other species outside of it that might be doing similar things, but it at least has this ability to, when it gets exposed to freezing, which does cause some physiological challenges to the cell, is it seems to activate processes that are involved in cell preservation. And so they basically turn off all of these cell death pathways, which do in some situations in some situations these pathways are beneficial. But what they're able to do is kind of put a pause on these normal developmental cell death pathways, repair the injury to the cells that's occurred, and then resume their normal function once they've cleared that damage. And so that's one process. The last thing I'll mention briefly here is that they're also really good at surviving dehydration. So they can, Antarctica is for the times of the year when it's frozen, there's not really any liquid water available. So they do tend to dehydrate. Well, that ability to dehydrate also helps them survive freezing as well, because when cells are frozen, or when the insect is frozen, the cell loses water and becomes dehydrated. And so those two kind of go together, this ability to survive dehydration and this ability to survive freezing.
Hmm. And it really can just dehydrate and sit there almost like a cocoon. And um is there an analogy to the water bears and how they survive these kinds of conditions?
Yeah, there are some similarities. I mean, the water bears are much more extreme in some sense. One of the things about the habitats these Antarctic midges are living in, they're cold by our standards, but they spend the winter buried under a thick layer of snow and ice that provides kind of an igloo effect. So as far relative to air temperature, their microhabitats where they're spending the winter are fairly warm. They get down, the typical winter temperature for this midge is like -3 to -5 Celsius, which, you're in Georgetown, DC. That's a pretty typical winter temperature, air temperature in DC even. So it's not So they don't survive crazy temperatures, but it's really the duration that's impressive. They can stay this way for 6 to 9 months continuously frozen, and they have such a short growing season. But yeah, there are some similarities there. The water bears can dry out a lot more. The Antarctic insect is pretty tough in that regard. They can lose about 70% of their body water and still survive. Humans, if we lose 10% of our body water, we're probably in a coma. So it's compared to humans, it's pretty good. They can't like completely dry out and form a cyst like some of the water bears can, but they're still pretty good in that regard. Um, and it does seem to help with the freezing as well. If you have less water in your body to freeze, that's less opportunity for large, sharp ice crystals to rapidly grow and expand and pierce tissues and cause damage. And so that's one of the reasons why from a biophysical standpoint, it seems to be useful to lose water in really cold conditions is to reduce the amount of water that freezes inside the body.
Yes, yes. And do you think there are implications for humans? And I know in science fiction there's a lot of talk about, on trips to Mars we can freeze our bodies and then we wake up later and slow down our metabolic processes. Do you think there's any hope or anything that we can extract, or is this more just in insects?
I sure hope so. I think in the more near term, which I mean by near term, I still probably mean after I'm retired, probably. But in the more near term would be things like cryopreservation of human tissues and organs. There are very few human cell types and tissue types that we're able to store at low temperatures
Hmm.
for things like transplants. And I mean, the you hear a lot about heart transplants. I think across the US, there's something like last I checked, 100,000 people waiting for heart transplants. And getting a heart transplant takes a lot of luck. Someone has to be about to die basically, and then they have to take the heart out and get it into the recipient with about a 4 to 6 hour window. And so it requires being in the right place at the right time. And so I'm kind of hopeful that if we can learn how insects like this Antarctic species can freeze, but also lots of other insects out there that can do similar, have similar adaptations, it might give us some clues into what is necessary to survive freezing, and then we could apply this to human tissues and organs to create organ banks and facilitate the movement of organs to different places or places even like when we do overseas expeditions for warfare or other reasons to have ability to have organs at the ready for that kind of stuff. I mean, insects have a simpler body plan than humans for sure, but if they still have organs, they still have multiple tissue types, and they're able to somehow coat all these in ice and wake up in the spring like almost nothing happened. So,
And is there a way that climate change changes how insects survive winter? Is it changing at all, or?
yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm glad you asked it because a lot of times when people think of climate change, what do you see in the news? It's heat waves, wildfires, droughts, which are obviously very important and real things that are happening. But if you look across much of the planet, so this is true in North America, it's also true in Antarctica, winter climate change is happening much faster than summer climate change. And so our winter, we probably don't notice it because in some cases it's a welcome change potentially. Or it's the difference between a pretty cold winter and a less cold winter you might not notice as much, and that does have implications for insects that are trying to survive the winter. And so we did a study on the Antarctic insect a few years ago that showed that if we bring them back to the lab and do simulated overwintering for 6 months in an incubator, the ones that we put at warmer temperatures don't do as well. They have lower survival, and the primary reason for that is they burn through more of their energy stores. And this is because, as I mentioned before, insects are cold-blooded. So if you raise the temperature, it increases their metabolic rate, which increases the speed at which they burn through that energy. And so in some cases, especially for cold adapted insects, a warmer winter may not be better. Now it's complicated because this can't be applied to every insect. And so when people ask, so what's going to happen with insects when if the winters get warmer, the annoying answer is it depends. It really depends on the insect and what it's doing. But in general, if an insect is in a state where it can't feed and replenish energy during the winter, which is true for many insects, warmer winters may not always be a good thing because they do increase that energy expenditure.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that's something we found out with this Antarctic insect, but it is that kind of balancing act between, lower temperatures are more stressful, but then the higher temperatures lead to more energy drain. And so it's this kind of balancing act between those two factors. And so it really depends on the particular insect, where it spends the winter, what its cold tolerance is, and so forth.
Yes, yes. And then when you talk about insects, are there you do an incredibly diverse amount of work across the genetics and physiology and ecology of insects. How much of an insect's ability to survive in extreme environment is genetically programmed versus something it can adapt to during its lifetime?
That's a good question. Yeah. So with a trait, for example, like the ability to survive freezing, it's what we call a quantitative trait, which means there's a genetic component to that and an environmental component. And so the genetic is pretty straightforward. It's the DNA that makes up that organism codes for various traits and processes that are important for surviving freezing. The environmental component is what's commonly called as phenotypic plasticity, or the idea that depending on the environment that an insect or any organism experiences during its lifetime will also shape its trait. This is true of humans as well. An example I like to give when I teach about these concepts is I have an identical twin brother. So I have a genetic clone out there who is 100% similar to me genetically, but he's an inch taller than me. And my hypothesis for why that is I was a wrestler in high school. And so for 3, 4 months of the year, I had to keep at a constant weight class as opposed to being a typical teenage boy that was eating ravenously and just allowing myself to grow. And so that affected my final body size. In this case, the environment was the nutrition that I received as a teenager compared to my brother who had none of these constraints. The same is true for insects when they get ready for the winter. And so in some cases, it's triggered by changes in day length. In other cases, it's strictly temperature change, but oftentimes it's a combination of the two. When the insect is, sensing in its environment that winter is coming, it'll undergo a number of physiological and biochemical changes that prepare it for the winter to make it better equipped to survive those harsh cold events. And so if you look at insects across the planet, there are genetic differences that are important as well. And so, for example, in the Antarctic insect I work on, it can survive freezing year round, which is another kind of sort of rare feature of it. Many insects that do survive freezing can only do so during the winter, during a very specific life stage. But in the case of the Antarctic insect, at least in the larval stages, anytime you take it out, it can survive freezing, but its ability to survive freezing does improve as it gets closer to winter because of things primarily due to decreasing temperatures. If we acclimate them to lower temperatures, and also the dehydration I mentioned as well, they tend to lose a little bit of water heading into the winter, and both of those factors together make them better equipped to survive the freezing. So
Hmm.
it's a combination of the two.
Yes, yes. And could, after studying insects this closely, what do you think most people fundamentally misunderstanding about them?
I would say one thing that I battle with in my daily life, once people find out you're an entomologist, you get lots of fuzzy cell phone pictures of brown smudges. What is this? Is it gonna bite me? Is it gonna kill me? What should I apply fire to it immediately? Tell me what's wrong here. But I think what people really should understand is that over 99% of the insects that you interact with are doing something important for the environment. There's relatively small percentage of the insects that we encounter are what we consider pests, and those are, the pests that eat our crops or the pests that spread diseases like mosquitoes. Now, that being said, that's not to minimize their impact. Some of those insects do have really big impacts, but I think it kind of leads to this natural instinct to see a six-legged or eight-legged creature in your house and assume it's harmful and try to kill it or get it out and do something with it. When in reality, we talk about pollinators, hundreds of different foods that we eat are pollinator dependent. So strawberries and blueberries and tomatoes, all different fruits and vegetables that you encounter would not be around without insect pollinators. um, a thing I like to, example I like to give with spiders, which is a sore subject in my house because my wife hates spiders, but um, the spiders across the globe, every spider eats hundreds of insects in its lifetime typically. And so if you're killing that spider on your porch, you're getting rid of that spider web, well, you're removing some free pest control services that that spider is providing you. And so, it's a really delicate balance, and insects are on the decline. There's been a lot of studies about this. They're calling it the insect apocalypse. And so, I would just encourage people to, take a step back and think about, some of the good things that insects do for us as well, not just instantly start calling the pest control company when you see something in your house.
Yes, yes. And yes, so that's extraordinarily hard to do for people who are very scared of spiders. I mean,
Yeah,
a
I get
spider
it.
to
No,
them
yeah,
is just
spider
another
phobia is a
insect.
real thing. Yeah.
Yes. Um, so, I wanted to bring this back to our audience because our audience of early career scientists and medical
Mhm.
professionals as well. Do you have any words of advice for them as someone who's kind of reached the pinnacle? I mean, Antarctic research is incredible. So, do you have any words of advice for them?
That's a good question. I think I mean, depending on where you are in your career, I think it's really important to find people that you enjoy doing work with. There's the instinct to go, chase after the highest profile institution or the highest profile lab group, whatever that may be. And some of those are great for sure. But I also think it's important to obviously, enjoy the work you do, but along with that, enjoy the people you're doing the work with. It's hard to be productive in a negative environment. So I always think, that part's really important if you're someone thinking about where do I want to either go to grad school or I'm in grad school, where do I want to work next? Where do I want to, if I'm applying for faculty jobs, not ignoring that people aspect. If you like the people, you can do good things. And then the other thing I think for grad students, maybe this is just me getting to be older and curmudgeon-y, but I think that with COVID, we lost a lot in terms of, it shifted the culture in terms of a lot of people now have more of a work from home mentality. And there are cases where that's totally great. But I know in grad school, some of the best learning I did was sitting in the office and, for lack of a better way of describing it, arguing about research, like with your colleagues, with your the people in your lab, the people in the department, just talking about research, getting used to thinking, someone might say, why are you doing it this way? And just kind of that back and forth, and really helps crystallize the communication side of it and thinking carefully about why you're doing things. And so I think that's a really good learning tool. So I try to encourage people in my group, spend time together at work. Don't, it's, we're kind of, I'm guilty of it sometimes myself. You close the door and check email during lunch and all that stuff. But, talking to people about your work and it's both from a mental health standpoint, it's positive interactions, but also helps with the learning too, to really think deeply about your science.
And when you think about the kind of benefits and drawbacks of collaboration, what are some, I guess, characteristics that make a scientist or an early career scientist exceptionally poised to benefit from the uh, milieu around them, all of the other ideas? Are there specific ideas like humility or um, kind of openness to new ideas, or is it better to be kind of a staunch advocate for your own uh, ideals and ideas and to just pursue that no matter what? Because in science, sometimes people can um, shoot down an idea before it really gains momentum, and you have to be on the cutting edge. I don't know if I worded that properly. Like, where do you draw the line between having a novel idea that is um, poised to break through and not being wrong or pursuing the wrong path?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It in some ways gets back to my comment before about finding people that you enjoy working with. One of the things I really appreciated about my PhD mentor, his name was David Denlinger. He's in the National Academy of Sciences. By all on paper, he's a real big shot, but he never acted like it. He was very approachable, very humble. But along with that, he never shot down ideas. If we said, and he trusted his people a lot to generate those ideas. It wasn't like a top down, like the PI had all the ideas and it was up to everybody else to execute those ideas. And so that's, something I think about a lot because, even as a professor and having done this for a long time, I still don't feel like there's a lot of days I still feel like I don't know very much. And so it's important to bring people to your lab. And so I try to think of grad students, I hire people from different backgrounds to come in and put their slant on something or bring their perspectives into one of the projects that we have in the lab and maybe take it in a different direction. And so that's, if you look at where the research proposal I wrote when I was applying for jobs versus what I'm doing now, it's very different. And a lot of that's driven by the really good people who came to my lab and pushed projects in different directions. So if you're a student in that situation, ideally you're in an environment that supports that. And so I think again, it is a balancing act. You have to get along with everybody. You don't want to be too, but it is, we do tend to have a scientific culture of skepticism and, oh, that won't work or don't bother doing that. But I think if you can, if you can find the right people to help foster that willingness to try new things, it can take you a long way. Now, there are obviously still the realities of finishing a project and getting your dissertation and all that done. So it's like anything, it's a balancing act. You can't take on everything that maybe excites you or every opportunity to collaborate. So I don't know if, it's hard to in this quick interview format to say, how you go about those decisions. But that is something to just be mindful of, I guess, is trying to, find that balance between taking risks, but also the realities of just getting your work done and moving on to the next stage of your career.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much for that. And I wanted to also ask about I wanted to bring back to one of the terms that we brought up earlier in this conversation, which was diapause. In the biography, I mentioned diapause. Um,
Yeah.
you know, could you maybe describe diapause for our audience and how it's similar to hibernation?
Yeah. So diapause is primarily, in a lot of ways, it is the insect. Oh, got blurry there for a second. Sorry. It's the
No worries.
insect equivalent of hibernation.
Hmm.
And so an insect goes, there we go. Get back in focus. Yeah. So it's a lot of, not every insect does it, but a lot of insects, they go essentially dormant for the winter. And this is primarily to, again, prepare for harsh temperatures that experience the winter. Also especially for insects that feed on plants. Plants go dormant in the winter as well, and so there's nothing to eat. And so it's really kind of a hunkering down strategy. So there's a few kind of characteristics of diapause. One is that for any particular insect, it's restricted to a particular life stage. And so it depends on the species, but some insects undergo diapause as eggs, some as larvae, some as the pupal stage, which is kind of a transition stage, some as adult. So it's really that species specific. So it's programmed to happen at a specific stage. Another characteristic of diapause is it's what we call anticipatory. So it's not a direct response to winter. It's something that happens typically in advance of winter. So that's why the most common cue for diapause is photoperiod. So insects sense that the days are getting shorter, and that tells them that winter is coming. And the reason for that is those cues are very reliable. Every year the photoperiod is the day length is the same on a particular day. But relying on temperature as your cue for going into dormancy may not be reliable because some years the low temperatures can come really suddenly. Some years they may not come at all. And so being able to program that dormancy in advance of the winter is important. And then once those insects are dormant, I guess two of the key features of most types of diapause is it leads to metabolic suppression. So it helps to conserve energy. So they lower their metabolic rates. And then the other thing they do is they rest development. So again, they get to a particular development stage and they just kind of stop there and they don't resume development again until the spring.
Hmm. And what's the most, I guess, extreme survival mechanism then that you've ever encountered in an insect?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I I think, I mean, I could go a lot of different directions with this. I mean, I find the 17-year cicadas very fascinating. We had
Mm.
those last year here in Kentucky. Just that there's still some debate about how or why it evolved, but it's in, it's one of the ideas out there is it evolved as a way to overwhelm predators and pathogens. If you just have these mass emergences once every 17 years, then even if a lot of them get eaten or some of them catch diseases, those diseases and those predators can't establish because then they can't wait 17 years for another brood to come out. And so it's a way to kind of avoid those, but just the ability to stretch out a life cycle that long is kind of crazy to me. There's other cicadas we have that have an annual life cycle, and so somehow this one species has been able to stretch that out for 17 years and also at the same time still emerge on such incredible precision. It's not 17 plus or minus 2 years. It's exactly 17 years as brood emerge. So I always found that one fascinating. The other one I enjoy reading about is there's a midge, another type of midge that lives in sub-Saharan Africa called the African sleeping midge, and they live in these temporary water pools that form in the Sahara during the rain season, and then it gets incredibly hot and dry after that. And so they're the only insect so far, to my knowledge, that's been described that can be what's called truly anhydrobiotic. So this is the mean the almost complete loss of water. So it's something like 97 to 98% of their water is lost. Again, they look just like little dried up crisps of dead insects, but they're still alive. And the groups in Japan that have worked on these have been able to, for example, like put them on a lab shelf for 18 years in this dry state and then pull them off and add water and they wake up. It's similar to if you ever had the pet when you were a kid called sea monkeys. They're like brine shrimp
Yes.
basically. Yeah, so
Uh,
that's the same thing. They completely dry out and they're just
hmm,
there almost indefinitely, depends on the species, but in some cases they can hang out that way for as long as they need to
hmm.
until water. So I always found those fascinating as well.
Yes, yes. Well, I wanted to thank you so much for joining today. This is really incredible, and I know a lot of people have experience with sea monkeys, so that was a particularly apt analogy here.
Yeah.
Do you have any final words for our audience or anything else? Or
No, this was a lot of fun. I think you did a great job. I would say again, in this kind of culture we're in now, be open to all different types of science. Maybe I'm sure I'm one of the weird ones that you have on your podcast because I'm
no?
sure it's a lot of medical people but just thinking about, these crazy Antarctic insects, maybe not, but we're hoping at some point it might help things with like cryopreservation and human medicine. So, it's that discovery is important, not just, I mean, the work to cure cancer and that type of research is super important. Don't take away from that at all. But, some of these other projects that may sound weird on the surface might actually have some important benefits down the line. So I think
Absolutely, absolutely. And
yeah,
we're all scientists. I mean, we understand
yep,
the importance of basic science research and laying the
of
foundation.
course, yeah. Hmm.
Thank you so much for all that you do. You're really an inspiration to me and to the audience. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me. Yeah.
Wonderful. So this is Cameron Sabat signing off.